In this paper, as Patrizio said, joined with Nicola, we are motivated by phenomena that we observe in advanced democracies since the last few years, namely the rise of nationalist and populist parties, often at the expenses of mainstream social democratic parties in many Western democracies. We also observe new dimensions of political conflict associated with immigration and also, to some extent, civil rights. And we also observe in many countries, in the US, but also elsewhere, an increase in polarization in a particular sense that individuals who are affiliated with opposite political groups tend to have views that differ on many issues. If I am a right wing in the US, I tend to be against abortion, against redistribution, against immigration, and over many different issues, my views are more correlated with my partisan affiliation than they used to be in the past. And we also observe more mistrust of opposite partisan opinions. Now, two remarks about these phenomena. First, they are global phenomena, so they affect many countries, many advanced countries, not just a few. And second, and this is more puzzling perhaps, these phenomena tend to be correlated with specific economic shocks. A number of papers by David Autor, by my Bocconi colleagues Colantone and Stanig, have shown that areas that have been hit by exposure to the rise of trade with China have become more polarized and in particular have given more support to the new nationalist and populist parties and also have become more anti-immigrants. Other papers exploiting survey data by Guido and Algan and several co-authors have shown that the support for right-wing populism is correlated with economic security, and similar data have been studied in Sweden. Now, the fact that these shocks and these economic securities is correlated with these phenomena is puzzling, because in the past, individuals who were economically insecure would seek protection by voting for the left. And now, instead, they support platforms that advocate tax cuts, reduction in the welfare state in some cases, and also are anti-immigrants in some cases. They support politicians that are racist in some dimensions. And this is puzzling. So why do these kind of economic shocks induce this kind of reaction? Why do they make me anti-immigrant or anti-black? And the answer that we provide to this question in this paper is that behind these political phenomena, there are very systematic belief distortions. We follow an established tradition in social psychology and also in political science that exploits the idea that my view of the world, my belief, is related to my social identity and my political identity. When I identify with a social or political group, I somehow adapt my view of the world to the group I identify with, and this introduces specific distortions in my beliefs. And what we have seen is that the economic shocks associated with globalization or technology have changed individual social identities, have led people to identify with different social groups. This has changed their political beliefs, has led to new distortions. Old distortions were abandoned, new distortions have been acquired, and this can explain the political outcomes that we observe. So we refer in particular to a literature that was developed in the 70s and in the 80s by a group of social psychologists associated with the names of Stajifel and Turner, in particular with the name of Turner, which is a later development of the social identity approach. Turner developed what is now called the social categorization theory in this view of the world. And the ideas developed by these authors view identification with a social group as a cognitive phenomena. So the idea is that when we categorize the world around us, we do so because we want to structure the world, and this introduces specific distortion. So there are experiments that have shown individuals segments of different lengths, and the individuals are asked to estimate the length of these segments. Then you put labels on these segments. One group is smaller and one group is larger. And then you ask individuals to, again, estimate the length of these segments. And what happens is that when you label them in this way, we tend to exaggerate between group distinctions and attenuate within group similarities. And this is a way to infer the structure of the world around us by simplifying what we perceive. And this distortion tends to be associated only with the dimensions that are associated with the categorization. So these social psychologists view social identification as a form of self-categorization. I assign myself to a particular group of individuals that are similar to me in contrast to some other group. And of course, this approach has been adapted also to politics, because politics is about us versus them. To which group do I belong, and which groups instead consists of my enemies. And there are two ideas that we try to formalize in our paper that we borrow from the literature. The first idea answers the question, what determines my social identity? And the social psychologists emphasize the notion of a metacontrast principle. I identify with a group of individuals that are similar to me in the dimension that is more salient in the particular situation. So that's one criterion, similarity between the individual and the group in the relevant dimensions. And the second criterion is the contrast between group. So it's easier for me to identify with a particular group rather than another group if group contrast is more pronounced between these groups. So if two groups are more different, this facilitates my identification with the group to which I feel more similar. So that's one notion. The second idea that we build upon concerns the consequences of identification. And this literature stresses the notion that when I acquire a social identity and I identify with a group, I tend to depersonalize myself. I view myself as a prototypical member of the group, and I lose track of my distinctive features. And by prototypical member of the group, I do not mean, and they do not mean, the average group member, but the group member that is most diagnostic of the differences between groups. And this is associated with the notion of stereotypes. So I identify with a group, and I become a stereotypical member of the group. So I slant my beliefs towards the features that are stereotypical of the group. And what we mean by stereotypical is, of course, a distortion of reality that exaggerates features of reality. So the stereotype is not false, it exaggerates true features that distinguish these groups. Okay, so this is what this literature emphasizes, and we apply it to the world of political economics, and the main result that we emphasize is that First of all, social identification leads to an exaggeration of the perception of group conflict. So when I identify, I tend to exaggerate group conflict. So this can explain changes and increases in polarization. To the extent that these social identities have become more relevant, this can explain why polarization has increased. Of course, polarization increases only in the dimensions that are associated with these social identities. So when you have economic shocks, like an inflow of immigrants, or exposure to trade, or technology shock, this changes the nature of economic conflict. New dimensions of economic conflict become more relevant. This changes social identities. In the past, if I was a blue-collar worker, I would identify with my economic class of blue-collar workers in opposition to capital owners, and I would exaggerate a class conflict between left and right. Now I have a new shock, a trade shock, that has a geographic dimension. It is associated maybe with my education and my residence, not with my being a blue-collar worker, because the shopkeeper in my area is also hurt by the shock as much as I am. And this changes my social identity. I now identify with a group of co-residents that are hurt by the trade shock or by technology, and I become nationalistic. By doing so, I abandon my left-wing class identity. So my beliefs are no longer distorted by an exaggerated perception of class conflict. And this makes me demand less redistribution from left to right in the traditional sense. And instead, I exaggerate my distorted perceptions of the feature that are typical of the conflict between nationalist and cosmopolitan. And that concerns trade protection. It also concerns immigration and other features, maybe views on abortion and homosexuality. And so this can explain why specific kinds of economic shocks that change the nature of economic conflict by changing social identity lead to new belief distortions and new forms of polarization. And so you can view at an abstract level this endogenous identity as a feature that amplifies and propagates the consequences of specific economic or social changes. Now, I mentioned the literature on social psychology. There is also related literature, a larger related literature on two aspects of what we do. One aspect is the notion of belief distortions, and in particular, there is a large literature on empirical literature by economists and other social scientists that shows that belief distortions are systematically correlated with partisan political identities. If I am a right-wing Republican, then I tend to regard that environmental change is not due to human causes, but instead other causes. And likewise, I have particular views about factual features of immigrants that are distorted. So this is one related literature. From a theoretical perspective, we build on the work that Bordalo, Giannaioli, Schleifer, and Kaufman have done, both theoretical and empirical, on stereotypes. So we adapt their formalization of stereotypes to our setting. There is also literature on motivated beliefs that attempts to explain similar empirical phenomena. Our formalization is different instead. Second, there is literature by economists on the relevance of identity. Akerlof and Cranton have introduced the notion of identity in economics about 20 years ago. Moses Shayo, an economist who was a PhD student at Princeton at the time, developed similar ideas on identity applied to a political economy setting, and there is a recent paper by Grossman and Helpman that also does so. Like these two papers by Shayo and Grossman and Helpman, we only focus on voters' behavior, so we do not attempt to bring into the setting the behavior of politicians, and we talk about identification with social groups, not with political parties. So I think the next line of research is to develop instead the supply side part of the political system, exploiting these ideas on identities. But we, like these previous papers, focus instead on voters' behavior. What distinguishes our approach from that of Shayo and Grossman and Helpman is that when thinking about the determinants of identity, these two papers think about a trade-off between similarity and social status. People want to identify with upper status groups. We don't take that approach. Empirically, we also see identification with groups with low status, not just with high status, and instead we emphasize this notion of Metacontrast principle. And second, the consequences of identification in these earlier papers is that they change your preferences. There are no belief distortions. Instead, we emphasize the effects on belief distortions. This is what we do in the paper. I probably will not have time to talk about all of it in this lecture. I start by explaining the consequences of identification in a one-dimensional model, showing you what we mean by belief distortions. Then we add two dimensions of economic conflict, and here identity becomes endogenous. Then we add a third dimension of nationalism, and finally, if I have time, I'll take you through some survey data. The contribution of the paper is mainly theoretical, but we also have some survey evidence that is consistent with the predictions of the model. Okay, so please interrupt me if you have questions as we go along. So we need a setting in which there is heterogeneity and there is uncertainty to talk about beliefs. So the simplest setting is the following one. There is a continuum of individuals, and individual income is uncertain. So epsilon tilde is the realization of income for a particular individual. And this random variable, future income, has a known distribution with mean epsilon. So think of epsilon as my expected future income, so my measure of social mobility. And it denotes a type. So I have a particular realization of epsilon, and you have a different realization of epsilon. In society, on average, epsilon is 0, so aggregate income is 1. And then we embed this in a simple model of proportional income taxes, which is used to finance a public good. And the public good has a linear marginal utility, constant marginal utility, and there are quadratic tax distortions. So the indirect utility function of individual with income with expected income epsilon is given by that equation, and V is the constant marginal utility of the public good. Inside the brackets, you have the quantity of the public good from the government budget constraints, net of the tax distortions. And there are two predefined groups of individuals: the poor in expected value and the rich. Okay? And everyone here, for simplicity, identifies with this group. If I am poor, I identify with the group of the poor, and vice versa if I'm rich. What are the consequences of identification? Well, if I type epsilon identifies with group G, then he overweights the realizations of his future income that are distinctive of his group. And following on the paper by Bordalo, Kaufman, Gennaioli, and Schleifer, a realization is distinctive of a group if it is more likely in the sense that it has a higher likelihood ratio for the average member of that group. So maybe this is best illustrated with this picture. So the red line would be the distribution of income for the average poor. And the right distribution, the blue distribution, is the distribution of income for the average rich. When I perceive my future income, I overweight the income realization that have a higher likelihood ratio in my group. So if I am poor, I overweight the realizations that are to the left of where the two lines that are to the left of where the two lines intersect. And if I am rich, I overweight the realizations that are to the right. So what is distinctive of the upper class is the shaded area to the right, and what is distinctive of the lower class is to the left. If you take this approach and then you assume that the distribution of income is normal, you can assume it's log normal, the results would be similar, you get a simple closed form solution, which is described here. Namely, my expected, so the left-hand side denotes the expected future income of type epsilon, given that type epsilon belongs to the lower economic group. And this is equal to his true expected income epsilon plus a parameter theta that multiplies the differences in income between poor and rich. And theta, this parameter theta, is the extent to which I overweight these prototypical realizations. So you can think of theta as capturing the strength of stereotypical thinking. If theta is 0, my beliefs are not distorted. The higher is theta, the more distorted are my beliefs. And what you see is that a poor here would perceive himself as poorer than he actually is, because he thinks of himself as a typical poor in contraposition to a typical member of the upper class. So the rich are overly optimistic and the poor are overly pessimistic in assessing their future income. And what is important is that this distortion is of a comparative nature. So if I am poor and the rich become richer, I feel poorer, even though my actual situation has not changed. The results are very similar if rather than being uncertain about my future situation, I form an opinion about some aggregate variable, like aggregate inequality, and I identify with a group that has systematic beliefs about this aggregate variable. Now, what are the implications of this assumption? Well, an obvious implication is that now, because of these belief distortions, if you take the average views of the poor and the average views of the rich, they are more different than if they were rational. So polarization between the average poor and the average rich is greater than if you have rational voters. Moreover, if you have not only actual polarization is increased by these stereotypes, but also perceived polarization is enhanced by stereotypes. So suppose that there are two groups, a left group and a right group, or a Democrat and Republican, two political groups. And the left group predominantly consists of poor, while the right group predominantly consists of rich. And now you ask, what is your perception about the polarization between these two groups in their preferred tax rates? And the answer is they exaggerate perceived polarization relative to actual. So the stereotypes amplify actual polarization, and they amplify the perception of polarization relative to what is the true polarization. And this is consistent with the survey data that show that indeed perceived polarization is higher than actual polarization. There is another interesting paper by Bordalo with other Harvard co-authors that shows that the distortion of perceived polarization relative to actual polarization is actually greater in on the policy issues where the stereotypical differences between Democrats and Republicans are more pronounced. Stereotypical in the sense of the likelihood ratios that I described before. And finally, if you embed these distorted beliefs in the indirect utility function that I described here, where rather than having your true type, you have your perceived future social mobility, the indirect utility function of individual epsilon is given by his rational indirect utility function, the first term, plus a term that gives you theta times the difference in the utility of the group you identify with relative to the utility of the opposite group. So in a sense, this is as if you care about group status. This is a consequence of our assumption. It's not an assumption. Distorted beliefs with this linear model imply that I evaluate policy as if I care about the status of my group. And in particular, if suppose that I am poor, if the rich become better off, this equation tells you that a member of the poor group feels worse off. And he feels worse off because the fact that the rich have become richer makes me, poor, focus more my attention on the income realizations that are typical of my group, namely poor, and I feel poorer. So the fact that the rich have become richer makes me worse off because I feel poorer, and vice versa for the rich. So this can provide a micro foundation, if you want, for the changes in preferences that other papers have discussed in association with the endogenous identity. Then we embed this in a standard model of political economy, where in particular a probabilistic voting model. The probabilistic voting model, without entering into a detail under symmetric assumption, imply that the political equilibrium coincides with the utilitarian optimum in the simplest setting. And here we get the same result, except the utilitarian optimum maximizes the distorted welfare function, not the actual welfare function. And so in this equation, tau 0 is the socially optimal tax rate, or the political equilibrium tax rate with rational voters. And now it's distorted by the polarization between these two groups and by how many rich and poor voters there are. Of course, the poor have a distorted view of the world, the rich have a distorted view of the world. These two distortions offset each other. If the size of the poor and the rich are the same, they cancel out and the equilibrium is undistorted. If, as plausible, there are more poor than rich, then in the simple model, the tax rate is too high relative to the equilibrium with rational voters because the poor perceive a greater group conflict than there actually is. And so they demand excessive redistribution. And the distortion is greater the more polarization there is in society in terms of the average difference between rich and poor, and the more stereotypical thinking is relevant. Okay, now that we have this machinery, we add a second dimension of political conflict to make identity endogenous. So suppose that there is a second policy instrument. Think of it as control of immigration or civil rights policy. And suppose that individuals have a quadratic loss function. So if I am a particular individual, my evaluation of Q in this loss function is given by the random variable psi tilde. And there is uncertainty about whether immigration is good or bad for me. So I don't know what psi tilde is. And psi tilde has, again, a distribution, a PDF, with a mean psi. And psi is typical of an individual. So think of psi as the average view that an individual have about immigrant or about abortion. And then the individuals differ in their expected social mobility, epsilon, and in their expected views on immigration, psi. And there is a distribution of these individual types in the population with mean 0 and 0. And so you can easily compute your indirect utility function by combining the previous utility function with this additional component of the loss function. Now, there are 4 groups in society. There continue to be the rich and poor as before, but now we have added 2 groups that differ in their views on immigration policy, on this new policy dimension. Let me call them the socially conservative and the socially progressive type, and higher value of higher value of Q and of psi correspond to more liberal views on immigration or abortion. Okay? So you can think of society as being distributed on this plane. On the horizontal axis, you have individual expected income mobility. On the social axis, you have individual expected views on immigration or civil rights. There are 4 groups. On the left, you have the poor and social conservative. Maybe if I can stand up. Do I have a microphone?
Oh, you can use this one. So that's,
So here you have the poor and social conservative. Here you have the poor and social progressive, and so on. And so this individual belongs to this particular group. Now, the assumption that we make is that you can identify either you identify with your income group, and so you identify in this direction if you are this individual, or you can identify with your cultural group. And so if you are this individual, you identify with this group of people. So this rules out a more granular identification with the group of poor and social conservative. This is just to reduce the number of possible cases that we have. We start by assuming that these 2 dimensions are uncorrelated with each other in the population, but the paper considers what happens when they are correlated. How do you choose whether to identify with your income group or with your cultural group? Well, the theory of social psychology that I described suggests the Metacontrast principle, and this is how we formalize it. So you optimize on this trade-off between identifying with a group that is most similar to you and it is more different from the opposite group. So what do we mean by more similarity? We look at your indirect utility function if you are type epsilon psi, and this is your bliss point on these 2 policy dimensions. So this is the utility that you get if you if you were at your bliss point. This is the utility that you get, same individual, if you are at the bliss point of the average group member. Okay, so this distance in your own utility at your own bliss point relative to the preferred policy for the group is a measure of how similar you are to the group. For the individual who coincides with the average, this distance is 0. The more distant you are from the average group member, the bigger is this distance. You also care about group conflict. Group conflict is defined in the same way. This is the utility of the average group member at his bliss point relative to the utility of the average group member at the bliss point of the opposite group. The bigger is this distance, the more conflict there is between these two groups. So you weight these two conflicts with an exogenous parameter, and you choose the dimension of identification that optimizes this trade-off, okay, between similarity between yourself and the group and group contrast. So if, for instance, groups are very different in terms of income, this is a force that pushes you to identify with your economic class. If the groups now become more different in their views on abortion and more similar in their economic income, this is a force that pushes you to identify with your cultural group rather than with the economic group. Then we take a second order approximation of these two objects that are nonlinear, and we obtain the following intuitive results, namely that an individual is more likely to identify based on his cultural group rather than his income group if he is more similar to that group. So similarity of the individual is one force. The second is group contrast. And the third dimension is the welfare relevance of these policies for the individual. So if the environment changes, and for some reason, cultural policy or immigration policy becomes more relevant in the welfare of the individual, this is a force that pushes him to identify with his cultural group rather than with his economic class. So in particular, if the weight that you give to policy Q in the welfare function increases, this is an example of cultural conflict becoming more relevant. But also, if taxes become more distorting, maybe because of globalization and tax competition, taxing the rich is becoming more distorting, this makes everybody agree that we don't want to redistribute much, and this makes cultural conflict more relevant and economic conflict less relevant. Okay, then, so this is an example when the parameters of the model are such that everybody identifies with the economic class, and this is what happens if everybody identifies with his cultural group. Now that we have an endogenous identity, we then ask what happens to beliefs when identity changes, and because we assumed that these two dimensions, epsilon and psi, so economic mobility and cultural conflict are uncorrelated, you only distort your beliefs in the dimension with which you identify. So if I identify with my economic class, I exaggerate economic conflict, and if I am poor, I demand an excessive amount of redistribution. And my views on immigration policies are undistorted because the two dimensions are uncorrelated. Intuitively, because the group I identify with, the poor, have views on immigration that are on average balanced because they are both socially progressive and socially conservative. Now, if cultural conflict becomes more relevant because there is an inflow of immigrants, I identify with my cultural group, I switch my belief distortions. My views on redistribution are no longer distorted because I don't exaggerate group conflict, and instead I exaggerate my conflict over immigration because this is what distinguishes the two groups of identification. And so the intuitive result is that as conflict over immigration or civil rights has become more relevant, identity switch, belief distortion switch, and as a result, redistributive conflict is dampened and cultural conflict or immigration conflict is exacerbated. And in particular, the poor and socially conservative voters who used to identify with their economic class and vote left now identify as nationalists, and they demand less redistribution and more protection from immigrants. And this is consistent with some survey evidence. There is survey evidence, first of all, that race and immigration are now perceived as more important problems. This is answers to questions, what do you see as the most important problem? The respondents are US citizens. These are ANES, American National Election Studies surveys. As you see, since 2013, you see that immigration and race are now are perceived as more important problems than they used to be. So first, there is evidence that the welfare relevance of cultural conflict has increased. Second, this is consistent with findings in a recent paper by Alesina and Stancheva that show that when you show respondents information about immigrants, not only they change their view about immigrants, but also they become less willing to redistribute. So the demand for redistribution is reduced if people are exposed either in survey data or in real data to immigrants. And that's consistent with the idea that this exposure has increased the relevance of the cultural conflict. There is also evidence, if you look at individuals who self-describe as members of a social class, also in the US, but so these are US data, but similar data are available in the UK. These are individuals who self-describe as belonging to the working class, the middle class, or the upper class. And here are their views on the desired size of government. And here are their views on the desired levels of immigration. And what you see is that economic classes tended to diverge on their views on the desired size of government, but no longer so. They tended to diverge in their views of immigration, but more so than in the past. So this is consistent with the idea that with the prediction of our model, if you were this particular individual, a socially conservative and poor individual, when you identified with your economic class, you exaggerated group conflict, and the opposite if you were rich. And now that you identify with your cultural group, you entertain the opposite belief distortion. Now, some of these changes would occur even in the absence of stereotypical thinking. What stereotypical thinking does is to exaggerate and amplify the consequences of these changes to the relevance of perceived conflicts. Then you put this in the political equilibrium, you can solve the political equilibrium. Let me skip this. You can imagine what the results will imply, that as the relevance of cultural conflict rises, taxes become less distorted and immigration policy becomes more distorted as a consequence of these beliefs. The third thing that we do is to add trade policy to this setting. So there is a third policy dimension, trade policy or tariffs. We write down a model with two sectors and two sources of income where tax policy redistributes between rich and poor, and trade policy redistributes between individuals who are exposed to import competition and those who instead produce in an export sector. And so here you have a three-dimensional conflict over redistributive taxation, over immigration policy, and also over trade policy. And the results are very similar, but we get an additional implication that I want to emphasize. So suppose that the correlation, so let's make the following assumption. Suppose that the correlation of your views on immigration or culture and trade protection are positively correlated with each other, but they are less correlated with your income. This is consistent with the data. So you can think of education as determining my views on immigration policy and cultural policy, and also determining whether I am a loser or winner from international trade. So more educated people tend to be socially progressive and more open in their views on trade. Less educated people tend to be more socially conservative and more protectionist. Income in the data is less correlated with my views on immigration and on trade. It is more correlated with my views on redistributive taxation. Okay, so if this is the structure of correlation in the data that induces this positive correlation between immigration and trade, and income is less correlated with the rest, then suppose that individuals identify based on economic class. Then they are distorted in their views on the size of government, on redistributive taxation, but their views on immigration and trade are not distorted because of the assumption of uncorrelated, that these traits are uncorrelated. Now, suppose that you have an increase in trade exposure, and this makes you switch your identity from economic class to protectionist. So I identify with a group of individuals that is a loser from international trade. Now, I abandon my distortion on income redistribution. I become distorted in my view on trade policy, but because those who demand the trade protection are also typically against immigrants, I distort my beliefs over immigration policy as well. And so a trade shock that increases my exposure to trade makes me hate immigrants. Which I did not hate before because I identified before with a group of people that was neutral towards immigrants, and now I identify with a group of people that also hates immigrants. And so this changes my view on immigration policy. And so this can explain why new shocks, like trade shocks, but technology shocks could have similar effects, leads to changes in attitudes that become more correlated with each other because the new conflict is related to education. It's less related to income. It's more related to education. And this new conflict is then more pervasive and applies to a bigger set of cultural traits. And this is consistent with evidence by David Autor and Colanton and Stanig about the consequences of trade shocks. And here, notice that a model with rational voters would not have this implication. There is no reason why in a model with rational voters, a trade shock would also make you anti-immigrant. Finally, in what, 3-4 minutes that I have left, how many? 10 minutes, okay, good. So in the 10 minutes that I have left, I would like to show you some features of the data. So the first data that we collected are similar to those that were recently studied by David Autor, but they are more detailed. So we follow the methodology of David Autor and collected the data from a survey of individuals that was asked between 2006 and 16 that has both a cross-sectional dimension and the panel dimension. And there are 4 questions in the survey that we study. The first is whether the individual is in favor or opposed to cuts in domestic spending. Second, what is his views on immigrants. Third, what is his views on the importance of abortion, not whether he is against abortion, but how important is abortion, which is correlated with aversion to abortion. And finally, how he voted in presidential and state elections. And we ask how these views are affected by living in an area where there's been an increase in import penetration from China. And like in David Autor's work, we instrument the increase in import penetration from China with a similar increase in import penetration in Europe. And this is what the data say. So here, the dependent variable is your views on government spending and your views on immigrants. The first column is when you do not have covariates, and the second column is when you have individual covariates or covariates of the commuting zone. The specification and the methodology is identical to that in the paper by David Autor. It's a dependent variable that is different. As you see, and there is also always a commuter zone fixed effect. So we are exploiting changes within commuter zones. When import penetration in the commuter zone increases, you become more likely to say that you favor cuts in domestic spending, okay, which is surprising but robust. And you become more likely to be averse to immigrants, particularly in the panel dimension, where we always have, we compare individuals' views of the same individual living in that commuter zone. And also you become more, you'd think that abortion is more important if you are more exposed, you live in an area that has become more exposed to import from China. And like in Autor, the last 2 lines are similar to what Autor finds, you are more likely to vote Republican. The second bit of evidence comes from France, and here we exploit a recent panel survey called the Dynamob survey. And we show that if you compare what happened in 2012 or 2013 with 2017, there is a clear change in the nature of political conflict. In 2012, the conflict over attitudes was on the typical left-to-right dimension. In 2017, it has become on the nationalist versus globalist dimension. And moreover, we match attitudes with voting data, and the predictions of the model tend to support the voting data. In particular, let me explain more in detail what we do. So we take 10 questions on 3 issues, and we extract from each issue the first principal component. The first issue is your views on redistribution and the role of the state in protecting workers. The second issue is your views on immigration and globalization. And the third set of issues is civil rights. So there are 3 questions, 4 questions, 3 questions. We extract the principal component from each of these groups of questions. We remove the effect of income and education, and then we normalize these principal components after removing the effect of your individual income and education. And the resulting variable can be interpreted as having higher values, meaning that you have more liberal views on these two issues, so you're more progressive. And here, higher values also mean that you are more right-wing on your views on redistribution. And then so here we plot two of these variables, your views on redistribution, the left and right dimension, and your views on globalization and immigration. This is your views on 2013. This is your views on 2017. Here we have a panel and a cross-sectional dimension. And an individual is, so this dot is the view of this particular individual on redistribution and globalization. Then, from these two variables, we ask, three variables, because there is a third variable that I have not shown. We ask the computer to estimate, to assign each individual to a cluster with a criterion of minimizing variability within the cluster. Okay? And this is what is the answer in 2017. The color denoted two clusters in 2013, and this is how the clusters are computed in 2017. So to minimize variance, clearly the conflict in 2017 is between groups of more similar individuals on their views on redistribution, while 4 years later this picture has changed, and groups are clustered by their opposite views on the other dimension. Moreover, the assignments to clusters is correlated with how these individuals voted in 2012 and 17 in the first and second round of presidential elections. And very quickly, as you can imagine, in 2013, individuals differed, voted between Hollande and Sarkozy, and those who voted for Hollande typically belong to the left-wing cluster. Those who voted for Sarkozy typically belong to the right-wing cluster. Instead, in 2017, cluster assignment is correlated with voting for Le Pen or Macron. And finally, we ask, suppose that you switched your vote. So we assume that how you voted corresponds to your identity. And so if you voted Macron or Le Pen, you identified on the globalist and nationalist dimension. If you voted left or right, you instead identified on the other dimension. And so we ask, suppose that you switched from either voting left or right in 2012 to voting in the first round, not in the second round, so when there were 4 candidates, to voting for Macron or Le Pen in 2017. What does the theory predict? Well, the theory predicted when you switch from left to right to globalist versus nationalist, you become more moderate on your views on redistribution, and you exacerbate your conflict on the views on immigration and civil rights. And looking at the evidence, this prediction tends to be supported, not 100% of the time, but a large number of cases is supported. The plus is what the theory predicts, the minus is, the plus and minuses here is the prediction of the theory. You can check the significance of the coefficients, and they are significant and on the right side quite often, although not all the time. So summarizing, I'm sorry if I have to rush and I didn't have time to complete this part, but summarizing, the idea is that that we elaborate and that is consistent with some of the survey evidence is that social identities can explain systematic distortions in political beliefs, and when identity changes because of economic shocks, you should see changes in these distortions and in political behavior. Now, there is a lot that is left out from this analysis, and probably the most important component of what is left out concerns the supply side of politics. Here we say that individuals identify with social groups. Maybe they identify with political groups, and that could have different implications, political parties. Also, you can think of specific politicians as being more effective in enabling voters to identify with them. So understanding political rhetoric as appealing to political identities is something that would fit natural in this line of research. And of course, more rigorous empirical evidence is also something that calls to be studied. So thank you very much.